Dobre Dien, and welcome to today's live stream on the 9th of May, and happy Europe Day. So, today's events have been quite hyped up in the last week. First, we had Russia threatening, or the Kremlin threatening, to attack Kyiv and its decision making centers, i.e., just blow up a lot of the center of Kyiv in response to a possible Ukrainian attack on Moscow today. So in Moscow, they're holding their May 9th parades. Well, the big parade that's supposed to have lots of military equipment, be show of might for the great Russian Empire. I should put great in inverted commas because obviously it doesn't look so great nowadays. And the Kremlin then announced that they weren't going to have any military equipment there. It's unclear whether they actually have any to spare or they just thought it'd be too enticing a target for the Ukrainian drones to hit today or not. But in any case, they scaled everything down. And then we had an announcement yesterday, first by Donald Trump, saying he had negotiated a ceasefire to extend until, I think it's 2 more days after today. But we'll see what happens once the May 9th parade is over in Moscow, whether the Kremlin thinks it's worth maintaining any sort of ceasefire up to that point. That was confirmed by the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. He actually passed kind of like an executive order under Ukrainian law, permitting Russia to hold their parade and saying that they wouldn't strike within 4 coordinates, which is basically on Red Square. But apparently outside of that, they're not committing to actually not hit anything according to the law. So very interesting. A lot of psychological warfare, I would say, with respect to this. And really, as someone who's here on the ground in Odessa, you can see the beautiful Odessa Opera House behind me. Having a 2 or 3 day ceasefire is effectively irrelevant because both sides will fire lots of rockets and munitions before it comes into effect, and then as soon as it's over, they will just fire lots of them, the ones they didn't fire in the intervening 2 days. So on a practical level, if you're a civilian here, it makes very little difference. And in terms of the trajectory of the war, it also makes very little difference. What it was important for and why the state was important was for Vladimir Putin to show that he has some control over what's happening in Moscow because he is under increasing pressure because his 3 day, or maybe if you're a pro-Russian, you think it was actually going to be a 3 week or 3 months, but whatever. We're over 4 years since they launched their extended invasion, thought they could take Kyiv, have their parade, whatever, within a month or so. And of course, that has turned into a complete train wreck. And now the Russian economy, as I predicted on both of my channels over 2 years ago, my contention was by the second half of 2025, their economy would be in huge trouble. They would also have problems with procuring materiel and manpower, but all three have come to pass, and they are in huge trouble. Their economy has effectively been in recession since last year. Okay, they can fudge the numbers and pretend it's not, but the people who are there in Moscow suddenly realize that the cost of living has gone up quite considerably, and their purchasing power is on the decline. And that doesn't look like winning, especially if you're stuck somewhere in Donbass on year 13, I guess it would be, since it really started in 2014 with the invasions of Crimea and Donbass by Moscow. So that definitely doesn't look like winning because almost no one in the Russian Federation actually cares about the people of Donbass or any of these places. Maybe a little bit about Crimea. I think that had a little bit more resonance in Russian society as a place. They probably possibly even been there, huge numbers of them because it was a popular summer beach resort, but no one cares about some town in Donbass. And Russia has enough poor industrial towns as it is. It doesn't need to take a few more of them, especially if they've been destroyed, to actually achieve anything. It is Vladimir Putin's desire to see the map expand once again on the Russian Empire before he leaves office in some shape or form, to, in his eyes, be seen in 50 years, 100 years as this great Russian leader who re-expanded the empire. And that is where he wants to be remembered. It's all about personal vainglory and his desires to re-expand the Russian empire, because Russia still remains in effect an empire. It's not a nation state, at least at this juncture in history. So we have this remarkable turn of events that the Ukrainian president is granting permission for the Russian president to actually host a parade. That is very impactful if, of course, Russians realize that their ability to celebrate the May 9th holiday is dependent on the acquiescence of the Ukrainian president, how the roles have been reversed, who has the cards. Well, it ain't it ain't Vladimir Putin and it ain't Donald Trump in this scenario. It is Vladimir Zelensky up to a certain point, and there will be a prisoner exchange, 1,500 for 1,500 prisoners. That's part of this deal that Russia can go ahead. That is more important to the Ukrainians because it is hard for Zelensky to turn down a significant prisoner exchange domestically than it would be for Vladimir Putin, because really at the end of the day, the average Russian is of no relevance in the calculations of the Kremlin, and no one really cares about the soldiers that have been sent to die in Ukraine, other than maybe their close family at the end of the day. So, what I can report to you today from the ground is that last night I did not see any air alerts, at least here in Odessa. So that is unusual. At least we'd have minimum air alerts, if not actual attacks. So for now, which I had expected last night, the ceasefire has held to that extent. But once that parade is over in Moscow, I am quite skeptical that we won't see just more attacks by the Kremlin once it is less in their interests to respect to ceasefire, which is basically that they want to be able to hold their parade. It will be scaled down. Of course, they also were limiting the internet, the mobile internet use in Russia as well, especially in Moscow. Again, this is having a knock-on effect because a lot of people who are influential, i.e. influencers, they depend on internet connectivity to also make money. And they ain't too happy about the fact that their bread and butter ability to make the bread and butter, make money, is being cut off by this regime in the Kremlin with their disastrous war. And many of them have spoken out for the first time. They don't particularly feel motivated by the fact that Russia is an imperial entity and it's expanded, well, it's attacked Ukraine, killed lots of people, huge numbers of people who come from the Russian Federation have also died in this war in the hundreds of thousands. That's not what is going to undermine this regime. What's going to undermine it is the fact that there's less money floating about in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Ultimately, that is the most likely thing to trigger a regime change or see Vladimir Putin sue for peace in some way and try to basically hold on to what he's grabbed. I don't think in that scenario he'll be letting the soldiers come home. He will probably send them somewhere else to attack some other country. It could be a test of Article 5 of NATO, would seem the most logical at this point. Some sort of incursion into the Baltic area, for example, would be probably the next move. But who knows? They probably have lots of places that they would like to reintroduce their influence in. Maybe Armenia, but they'd have to go through Georgia to get there. So that is the situation on the ground. Until about 10 minutes ago, the sun was not out and it was actually a little bit chilly. That's why I actually wore this jacket today. But now you see the sun is back out. So it is a beautiful afternoon here in Odessa. And until now, we haven't had any air alerts. So I guess that's all good. But I will not be expecting that to last the whole weekend. So if you're new to this channel, I have a background in international relations. I've been living on and off in this region for over a decade. I speak both Russian and Ukrainian, as well as some other languages in the region. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced and unique perspective from the ground inside Ukraine. And yeah, drop your questions and your comments if you are watching this, even if it's on replay, and I will endeavor to give you some of my personal insights into what's going on. I think we can now say, at least I'm going to say in my analysis, that this phase is the beginning of the end of two things: the Putin regime and the Russo-Ukrainian war. At least this phase is the Russo-Ukrainian war, because you can tell there are scenarios that it might restart again, obviously in 10, 20 years, depending what happens. But I think we're going to see a gradual deterioration of the economy in Russia. There may be the great white hope has been for the last 2 years, the election of Donald Trump is what Putin was banking on, was enough of an incentive to keep, and a justification for it to keep going in 2023 and 2024 until Donald Trump was elected. He has changed the dynamics in the White House, which have been very favorable to the Kremlin over Kyiv in the last, whatever he's back in power for 50 months, but even he'd announced a lot of it during his campaign trail and when he was waiting to be inaugurated. But it's not going to be enough. And I said that even when that aid was held up in the US Congress back in, it was probably the summer of, or early summer, maybe late spring of 2024, that even without that aid, Ukraine would resist. It would just drag on the war for many more years. And that aid got through at the time and was a stopgap for Ukraine while they develop out their own capabilities. At the moment, the US and Ukraine are not really allies. Unfortunately, it's not the will of the majority of the American people. They support Ukraine over Putin. It's not the will of the Republican Party in terms of its voters or probably even its politicians. Again, they support Ukraine over Russia. It's a 40-60 split within the MAGA movement that supports Putin over Kyiv, over Zelensky. And most of that is down to the called the personality around Donald Trump. Just Donald Trump doesn't favor Ukraine over Russia, and that's the reason they go along with it. Donald Trump did one of his flip-flops that he does constantly. Unfortunately, it hasn't been with respect to Ukraine and Russia, and suddenly says tomorrow that he's Putin's terrible, and he's a loser, and Zelensky's great. It will suddenly be 80-20 in favor of Ukraine also amongst MAGA because it's basically a cult of personality to a large extent there. So they're just whatever Donald Trump says, they'll go along with. So that is the reason why we see this White House backed up by J.D. Vance, who seems a lot more ideologically opposed to Europe in general, and these people who are in favor of liberal democracy in Europe and Ukrainians. You saw that disgraceful debacle in the White House when he was basically telling Ukrainians to keep saying thank you, even though clearly he is against Ukraine and hasn't done anything to help Ukraine. He actually said recently that the achievement inverted commas, by this administration in foreign policy that he's most proud of is cutting off the aid to Ukraine, basically helping Vladimir Putin and Russia is what he says the big achievement. It's not capturing Maduro. So he puts it above capturing Maduro, which is basically the only real achievement in foreign policy that this administration has been successful at, because at the moment this war in Iran is a bit of a train wreck, and we have to see how it all ends in reality, but it hasn't worked out strategically as the US would have hoped, or the current White House administration would have hoped, or what they had planned for, or lack of plan for, because they don't seem to have had a plan for when, after killing many of the leaders and Iran not capitulating what the hell they were going to do. Seems to be just making it up every day at the moment, but we'll see how that pans out in the next few months. I don't expect that situation to continue because it pushes up gas prices, petrol prices in the US, and we've got the midterms coming up, so that will be very, very bad for Donald Trump and the White House, because their allies in the Republican Party or the Republican Party would be in a very, very bad position going into the midterms if we just have high gas prices and if the economy is doing even worse than it has been since he took over. So with all of that said and outlined once again, we are at the beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin's regime and the Russo-Ukrainian war. How long both phases are going to last? Obviously, that still has to happen. Very hard to say. These things, in hindsight, always look very obvious. Like the collapse of the Soviet Union, you would have been hard-pressed to find anyone in 1987 or 1988 who was serious and an analyst who thought that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. But afterwards, it seems people can give you a list of reasons why it was almost certain that it was going to collapse. So this is how these things unfold. And it could be rather dramatic, well, probably be rather dramatic when it finally happens for both the demise of Vladimir Putin and the ending of at least this phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I mentioned a few times in these live streams, Igor Girkin sits in a Russian prison. He's a Russian ultranationalist. He was involved in the invasions of Crimea and Donbass back in 2014. And he's in prison because he's one of the few people, I guess, that doesn't get defenstered, if that's quite the verb we use in English for defenestration, i.e., falling out of a window, is that apparently is a step too far. But he criticizes the Russian leader Vladimir Putin quite frequently because he says basically he's a strategic moron with respect to how he's been running this war. And I quoted him last year as saying that the chances of Russia coming out with a strategic victory are very slim. That's what he was saying in the, it was the spring or summer 2025. And he saw that it was basically a toss up between either Ukraine taking back all its territory and basically having a complete victory, or some in between situation where Russia holds on to a lot of the occupied territory, at least for the medium term, and then presumably the war would just restart in some shape or form in the future. A year on, he now says that even if Putin goes for another mobilization, which he's basically put off since the autumn of 2022, it is now too late to actually help Russia achieve a strategic victory. So he's basically eliminating to two options. He just basically doesn't see any chance at this point of Russia coming out victorious. And I mean, there's always a chance. I mean, if we say it's 0.1% or whatever, but basically it's down to whether Ukraine will get a complete victory or Russia will, probably with the connivance of the current White House administration, push the Ukrainians to some sort of armistice, and we'll end up in a situation where the can is kicked down the road and the war will almost certainly start again in earnest in another phase. Maybe that's going to be 2 months, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. We'll have to see. I'm going to remain optimistic that we won't have that scenario where we have some sort of interim phase before the war starts again. We'll actually see a complete Ukrainian victory. It's not guaranteed whatsoever at all, but that is what I'm going to remain optimistic on and advocate for. So what I can, at least with my analysis, say is that we are in this phase of the beginning of the end. And the Russian economy is in huge trouble. The attempts by the Kremlin to further clamp down on the public and restrict their ability to use the internet has not gone down well. And we've seen a bit of backlash from the public in Russia. And that now creates a huge problem for Putin, because what is his solution after he gets this debacle of a parade out of the way, which has already been humiliating at this point that they had to even discuss would they be able to hold her now and make all these traces. You don't do that out of a position of strength. You do that out of a position of weakness, right? Basically, her having members of their administration hysterically cry out that they'll attack Kiev if their grandiose parade, well, not so grandiose parade, doesn't go ahead unmolested. So this just symbolizes how much Putin is in trouble domestically, and he doesn't have a realistic path to victory in this war anymore. He only has this, I guess, not complete, it's either going to be complete defeat or it's going to be some sort of impasse that's then formalized for a certain amount of time, which is what Trump administration has been pushing for. Well, really what they've been pushing for is a mid to long-term capitulation by Ukraine, withdrawal from Donbass. Ukraine's not going to do that, at least hopefully, because they don't need to militarily. It can probably hold out in the Donbass for 3 to 5 years more, we'll say, with the current trajectory of the war. And that's only if Russia can keep the war going for that long with that intensity, which doesn't look likely at this point. But maybe there's stuff going on in the background where they're trying to they're obviously trying to pressurize Zelensky. You got the real estate moguls who know nothing about diplomacy going out there, Kushner and Stevie Witkoff, who definitely will go down in history as one of the worst diplomats, in inverted commas, in U.S. foreign policy history. You just have to look at, he's in charge of the Middle East and Russia, Ukraine. This war is supposed to get solved on day one, and obviously we're no closer now. The only reason we're closer now is maybe because the Ukrainians have managed to, in spite of the White House's actions, further harm the Russian economy and stop Russian advances, at least slow them down quite considerably on the battlefield. Again, in spite of the White House's actions. And you see what's happening in the Middle East. It's just been a complete catastrophe in terms of diplomacy. over the last 15 months. So that clown show will probably go on. I don't see any indication at the moment that Trump is going to change course and maybe send out some competent people to do the diplomacy, at least not before the midterms. We'll see after the midterms what the results are. Maybe they are forced to basically behave a little bit more seriously with respect to U.S. foreign policy than they have in the first 15 months. Maybe they would stop threatening their allies as much. But anyways, let's be optimistic and hope that we don't have to discuss U.S. invading Greenland again for the remainder of this administration. So drop your comments and your questions down below. If you're planning to come here to Ukraine, I have my guide there for coming to Ukraine during the Russo-Ukrainian war. You'll get access not just to logistical information, the background of what's going on here, but also to my hospitality guides, to my favorite cafes, restaurants, cocktail bars, shisha lounges, and even clubs in cities like here in Odessa. It's going to be a fantastic summer here, I'm pretty sure. In spite of everything that's going on, it's just about to warm up, actually. Arcadia, the beach area, gets started at the end of May. It's already here in the city center, more or less summer season. And also you have it for the capital Kyiv, you have it for Lviv in the west of Ukraine, Chernovtsi in the west of Ukraine, and Uzhhorod in the west of Ukraine. That's where most guys are going. Some are also going to other cities because they're interested in investing in real estate, like going to Kharkiv or to Mykolaiv. So I might update it in the future and out those. But for now, since I haven't gone to those two cities in a few years, Mykolaiv or to Kharkiv since 2021, I've limited the cities that actually go to myself, which are those 5 cities: Kyiv, Lviv, Odessa, Chernovtsi, and Uzhhorod, and that is available down below. You see a link in the description to this live stream. You can go and invest in that now if you're on your way here sometime over the summer, because it's going to be a fantastic summer, I'm pretty sure. This thing there, I'm not sure. The opera house is working here. And I guess that's probably for some excursions because already we're in the early part of the summer tourist season here in Odessa. So if you just joined this live stream, so far, from what I can see, at least here in Odessa on the ground, the ceasefire is holding, but we'll see what happens as soon as this parade is over in Moscow. But again, just to re-emphasize the theme of this, one of the themes of this live stream, this is the beginning of the end of this phase of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the Putin regime. I don't see him lasting indefinitely. We'll see how it all ends for him. But he's in a very weak position. Maybe by managing to pause the war and kick the can down the road, he'll be able to then tighten the screws in Russia and create a totalitarian state so he can stay in power. But basically, we've seen with the backlash that he's received from the restrictions on the internet and other things that are happening in Russia that the government can't respond to, and the declining economy. And they seem to have to back down on the oppression and the restrictions a bit. That's not a good sign if you are a dictator like Vladimir Putin in terms of staying in power. That's already showing weakness. And it's kind of, from my point of view, a matter of time. Can't say these things 100% until they happen, of course. But no doubt in a few years, people look back and say, well, clearly this May night parade was a sign that he lost power and credibility. But, when you're living the moment, all these things are not like being the Monday morning quarterback with 2020 vision looking back in hindsight. So I would say I'll wrap it up there for today. I'm going to also enjoy a little bit of my Sunday afternoon. It seems a lot more peaceful than normal, at least in terms of the air alerts. And yeah, it's been a bit of a crazy few days. We had a lot of hysteria from the Kremlin. Then we had this agreement announced last night, which again was kind of compounding the humiliation on them, with Zelensky basically legally granting the Muscovites permission to hold their May 9th parade. You wouldn't have foreseen this when the invasion started in February 22, and certainly not when we had that infamous diplomatic debacle in the White House with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump trying to bully Zelensky and the Ukrainians and saying they hold no cards. Well, apparently they held a lot of the cards, maybe even a royal flush. So on Europe Day, I wish you all the best, and Slava Ukraini, From Slava do Peremoghi, from Odessa Mama in free Ukraine.